On a cold evening in January 1943, in the small market town of Lavenham, Suffolk, England, Corporal James William Carter of the 92nd Infantry Division pushed open the heavy oak door of the White Hart pub. The warmth that greeted him carried the scent of tobacco smoke, wet wool and centuries of absorbed beer. Conversations didn't stop immediately, but they slowed, like a phonograph winding down. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward the doorway, 23 white faces. Carter stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, wore the uniform of the United States Army with 3 chevrons on his sleeve, and carried himself with the quiet dignity his grandmother had taught him back in Birmingham, Alabama. He had no idea that this single moment, this simple act of entering a public house for a pint after a 14-hour shift loading supply crates, would begin a transformation that neither he nor anyone in that room could have imagined. What Carter expected, based on 26 years of life in the American South, was rejection. What he received instead would challenge everything he understood about his place in the world. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the account of how a small English village became the unlikely setting for one of the most profound cultural encounters of the Second World War, and how the friendship forged in a country pub would ripple through 2 nations in ways that are still felt today. Carter had arrived in England 3 weeks earlier as part of the massive build-up of American forces in preparation for operations across the Channel. The 92nd Infantry Division, an all-black unit with white officers, had been stationed at various locations across East Anglia. Carter's unit, tasked with logistics and supply operations, found themselves billeted in requisitioned buildings around Lavenham, a town whose medieval wool trade prosperity had left it frozen in time with crooked, timber-framed buildings leaning against one another like old friends. The town itself seemed barely touched by modernity, with narrow cobblestone streets that had known the footsteps of merchants and craftsmen for half a millennium. The United States Army had brought its segregation policies across the Atlantic intact. Black servicemen and white servicemen were kept in separate units assigned separate duties, and increasingly, as American military police began to enforce unofficial rules, separate recreational facilities. Carter had heard the stories from other black soldiers who'd been in England longer. Some talked about British pubs refusing them entry after pressure from white American military police. Others spoke of towns where American officers had requested that local establishments observe the color line to prevent friction between white and black American troops. The American military command seemed determined to export every aspect of Jim Crow to European soil, as if segregation were as essential to military operations as rifles and ammunition. But Carter had also heard different stories. Whispered accounts of British families inviting black soldiers to Sunday dinner. Tales of pub owners telling American military police where they could stick their suggestions about segregation, though usually in more colorful language than that. Reports of English women walking arm in arm with black servicemen, utterly unconcerned with the fury this provoked in white American soldiers. Accounts of British civilians who seemed genuinely baffled by American racial attitudes, who couldn't comprehend why men fighting the same enemy should be kept apart based on skin color. The truth, Carter was learning, was complicated and contradictory, and far more hopeful than anything he'd experienced in America. On this particular evening, Carter had simply wanted a drink. He'd spent 14 hours in a freezing warehouse, loading crates of ammunition, medical supplies, and rations onto trucks bound for depots across southern England. His hands were raw despite his gloves, his back ached from lifting 100-pound boxes, and his feet felt like blocks of ice. The temperature in the warehouse had hovered just above freezing all day, and the work had been relentless. The trucks had to be loaded, the supplies had to move, and the deadline had to be met. That was the nature of logistics work, unglamorous, exhausting, and absolutely essential. He'd walked past the White Hart every day for 3 weeks, watching the locals come and go, hearing laughter spill out into the street even under blackout regulations. The pub represented something he'd never experienced, a normal public space where working men gathered after their shifts. In Alabama, such places didn't exist for men who looked like him. Bars in black neighborhoods existed, certainly, but they were different, marked by poverty and police harassment and the constant awareness of being barely tolerated. White establishments were simply forbidden territory, enforced by law, custom, and violence. The interior of the White Hart was exactly as he'd imagined from the outside, yet somehow more. Low timber beams blackened with age crossed the ceiling, some barely 6 feet from the floor, forcing taller patrons to duck. A fireplace large enough to stand in dominated one wall, flames crackling around logs the size of a man's torso. The warmth was almost overwhelming after the cold outside, and Carter could feel his frozen fingers beginning to tingle painfully as circulation returned. The bar itself was dark wood, polished by countless elbows over countless years until it gleamed in the firelight. Behind it stood a man Carter would later know as Thomas Whitmore, the publican, a man of perhaps 55 with the build of someone who'd done physical labor all his life, and the careful eyes of someone who'd learned to read people accurately. Shelves behind him held an array of bottles, fewer than there would have been before the war, Carter guessed, but still respectable. Whitmore looked at Carter. Carter looked back. The moment stretched. Carter could hear the pop and hiss of the fire, the creak of someone shifting in their seat, the sound of his own breathing. Every face in the room was turned toward him, every conversation suspended. He'd been in this position before, the only black person in a room full of white people, but usually there was a clear script. Usually there was a defined role for him to play, a set of expectations to navigate. Here, 3,000 miles from home, he had no idea what the script was. Then Whitmore said, in a voice loud enough to carry across the room, "Evening, soldier. What'll you have?" The conversations, which had been merely quiet, stopped entirely now. Carter approached the bar, acutely aware of every eye on him, every breath in the room. His boots sounded loud on the worn floorboards. He could see details now that he hadn't noticed from the doorway. Photographs on the walls, mostly of local sports teams and what looked like home guard units. A dartboard in one corner, tables scarred by years of use, each probably with its own history. "A pint, sir," Carter said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "Whatever you'd recommend." Whitmore nodded once, as if Carter had passed some kind of test Carter hadn't known he was taking. He selected a glass from beneath the bar, checked it for cleanliness with a practiced eye, and began to pull a pint of bitter. He took care to get the head just right, tilting the glass at precisely the correct angle, filling it with the slow deliberation of a man who took pride in his craft. He set it on the bar with a soft thunk. "First one's on the house," Whitmore said. "Welcome to the White Hart. That'll be 3p for the next, same as anyone else pays." Carter reached for his wallet, but Whitmore shook his head firmly. "I said first one's on the house, you deaf as well as American." A snort of laughter came from somewhere in the room, breaking the tension like a stone through ice. Carter found himself smiling despite his nervousness. He picked up the pint, nodded his thanks to Whitmore, and turned to survey the room. There was an empty stool near the fire, but not too close to any of the other patrons. Carter made his way to it and sat down, cradling the glass in his still cold hands. For perhaps 5 minutes, he sat alone. The conversations around him resumed slowly, carefully, like birds returning after a loud noise. Carter drank his bitter, which was warm and flat by American standards, but somehow exactly right for the moment. The taste was strange, more complex than the beers he was used to, with a slight bitterness that explained the name. He'd done it. He'd walked into a white establishment, ordered a drink. Dan sat down to consume it. No one had called him boy. No one had told him to use the back door. No one had suggested he'd be more comfortable elsewhere. No one had threatened him with violence or arrest. The fire warmed his back, and the beer warmed his insides, and Carter allowed himself to relax marginally. He studied the room through lowered eyelashes, not wanting to make eye contact that might be interpreted as challenging. Most of the patrons were older men, past military age or in reserved occupations. A few younger women sat in one corner, munching crisps and talking in low voices. Everyone was dressed in the kind of worn, practical clothing that spoke of rationing and make do and mend. These were working people, Carter realized. People not so different from his own family, just trying to get through the war with dignity and tact. Then a man approached. He was perhaps 70, lean as a whip, with hands gnarled by a lifetime of work. He carried his pint and a bar stool. Without asking permission, without any preamble at all, he set the stool down next to Carter and sat. "Arthur Pemberton," the old man said. extending a hand. "Worked the railway all my life. Retired now, more's the pity. A man needs purpose, you understand." Carter shook the offered hand, feeling calluses that matched his own. "James Carter, Corporal, United States Army. Pleased to meet you, sir." "Sir?" Pemberton repeated with amusement. "Haven't been sirred since I left the service. I was in the last war, you know. Some. Passchendaele, the whole bloody business. Pardon my language, though I expect you've heard worse." "I don't mind," Carter said, still slightly dazed that this was happening at all. "You're with the supply units, then? Saw your lot unloading at the railway depot last week. Impressive operation, very organized. We never had anything like that scale of logistics in my day. It was all mud and confusion, and trying to get ammunition to the guns before Fritz sent over another barrage." "Yes, sir. Yes, logistics and supply. Not very glamorous, but somebody has to do it." Pemberton nodded thoughtfully, taking a long drink of his bitter. "Important work, that. An army marches on its stomach, as old Bonaparte said. Though I suppose these days it rides on its petrol tank, doesn't it? Everything's mechanized now. Trucks and lorries and half-tracks. In my day it was horses and mules and men carrying loads on their backs." He shook his head at the memory. "My grandson's in North Africa right now, Royal Engineers. Haven't heard from him in 3 months, but no news is good news, they tell me. Or at least that's what I tell myself at night when I can't sleep." And just like that, they were talking. Not about race, not about segregation, not about any of the things that would have dominated such a conversation in Alabama. They talked about the war, about Pemberton's memories of the previous conflict, about railway work and supply chains, and the strange Suffolk weather that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or merely threatened to rain. Pemberton had worked for the railway for 47 years, starting as a young man before the Great War and continuing until retirement just last year. He knew every station between Lavenham and London, every signal box, every stretch of track. He talked about the changes he'd seen, the steam engines giving way to newer models, the increase in freight traffic as the war effort ramped up. Another man joined them within 20 minutes. Then another. By the time Carter ordered his second pint, paying his 3p and refusing Whitmore's attempt to wave it away, he was part of a group of 5. They were farmers, labourers, one schoolteacher and a butcher. They asked him about America with genuine curiosity, not the hostile interrogation he might have expected. What was Alabama like? Was it as hot as they'd heard? Was it true Americans ate pie for breakfast? How did he find English beer, English weather? English roads, which apparently all Americans found comically narrow. Carter found himself relaxing in a way he couldn't remember relaxing around white people before. These men weren't performing tolerance or making a show of acceptance. They simply treated him as what he was, another working man in uniform, far from home, doing a job that needed doing. When he made a joke about nearly hitting his head on the low beams, they laughed. When he asked questions about Lavenham's history, they answered with the enthusiastic detail of people proud of their town. The schoolteacher, a man named Davies with wire-rimmed spectacles and thinning hair, launched into a 20-minute explanation of the medieval wool trade that had built Lavenham's fortune, complete with architectural details of the surrounding buildings and economic analysis of the trade routes that had made the town wealthy 5 centuries ago. "You're sitting in a piece of history," Davies said, warming to his subject as teachers do. "This building's been here since 1427. Think of that, 516 years. This pub was serving ale before Columbus sailed for the Americas, before printing came to England, before the Reformation tore Europe apart. The same families drank in this room through the Wars of the Roses, through Henry VIII's break with Rome, through the Civil War, through everything. And now here we are, and here you are, American and Englishman together, and it's still standing, still serving its purpose." Carter tried to imagine that kind of continuity and failed. America, even the oldest parts of America, was an infant by comparison. His own family's history went back only as far as his great-grandfather, a man whose name Carter knew but about whom he knew little else. The weight of slavery had erased everything before that, severing connections to whatever African homeland his ancestors had been stolen from. His grandmother could tell stories about her childhood, but before that was darkness, a deliberate forgetting enforced by violence. The evening wore on. The fire burned down and was built back up, pints were consumed, jokes were told, and at some point Carter realized he was enjoying himself more than he had in months, maybe years. The conversation ranged widely. They discussed Churchill's latest speech, the progress of the war in North Africa, the challenges of farming under rationing, the upcoming cricket season, assuming cricket could resume properly after the war. They argued good-naturedly about whether the American Lend-Lease program was generosity or calculation, about whether the RAF or the United States Army Air Forces had the better bombers, about a dozen other topics. When Carter finally stood to leave, checking his watch and realizing it was nearly 10 o'clock and he had another early shift tomorrow, Pemberton shook his hand again. "You'll come back, I hope," the old man said. It was clearly not a question but a statement of expectation. "If I'm welcome," Carter replied carefully, still not quite believing this was real. Pemberton frowned, genuine confusion crossing his weathered face. "Why wouldn't you be welcome? You pay for your drinks, you don't start fights, you're good conversation. That's all anyone asks in a proper pub. That and not spilling your pint, though we forgive the occasional accident." Carter walked back to his billet through streets dark under blackout regulations, guided by memory and a sliver of moon barely visible through the clouds. His head buzzed slightly from the beer, but his thoughts were clear. Something significant had happened, though he couldn't quite articulate what. He'd been treated as a human being deserving of basic dignity and respect. It shouldn't have been remarkable. In a just world, it would have been utterly ordinary. But it was remarkable, and Carter knew he would remember this evening for the rest of his life. Over the following weeks, the White Hart became Carter's regular stop. Not every evening. His duties didn't always permit that, but 3 or 4 times a week at least. He learned the rhythms of the place, the unspoken rules that governed pub life. The farmers who came in after market day, smelling of livestock and soil, their faces reddened by wind and sun. The old men who claimed the same seats every evening and debated the war news from the wireless with passionate intensity, arguing over Montgomery's tactics in North Africa or the situation on the Eastern Front. The younger women who occasionally stopped in, though always in groups and always briefly, since pubs were still primarily male spaces. The men who worked shifts at the nearby aircraft repair facility, who came in tired and grease-stained and drank their pints in companionable silence. He also learned about the tension his presence created with some of his fellow Americans. White American soldiers, particularly military police, had begun making their feelings known. Carter heard from other black soldiers about encounters, confrontations, warnings. A black private told him about being stopped by American military police in Bury St. Edmunds and told in no uncertain terms that he should stay out of establishments frequented by white soldiers. Another recounted being followed by military police who seemed to be looking for any excuse to cause trouble. The American command structure, uncomfortable with the British refusal to enforce segregation, tried various approaches. Some officers requested that publicans observe separate nights for white and black soldiers. Some tried to declare certain establishments off-limits to black troops, though they couldn't enforce such restrictions without British cooperation, which was seldom forthcoming. But the British, by and large, refused to cooperate. They'd been at war for over 3 years by this point. They'd endured bombing, rationing, separation from loved ones, and constant fear. They'd seen their cities damaged, and their young men sent off to far corners of the world. They'd accepted restrictions and hardships with what they considered proper stoicism. But being told by Americans how to run their own pubs, their own country, was a step too far. Whitmore, the publican, told Carter about a visit he'd received from an American military police officer, a captain who'd suggested that serving black soldiers might create problems. "I told him we'd been serving soldiers of all types for 5 centuries and hadn't had problems we couldn't handle," Whitmore said with evident satisfaction, wiping down the bar as he recounted the story. "Then I told him that in my pub, the only colour I cared about was the colour of a man's money, and it better be British currency, properly exchanged. He didn't care for that. Got all puffed up like a toad. Suggested I might find my establishment declared off-limits to American personnel entirely." "What did you say?" Carter asked. Fascinated by this glimpse into conflicts he'd only heard about second-hand. "I told him that would be a shame for the white American lads who'd been coming in, since they'd been excellent customers and caused no trouble, but that it was his decision to make, and I certainly wouldn't stand in the way of American military discipline. He left after that, face red as a proper English rose. Haven't seen him since, which suits me fine. The incident was one of many. British civilians, Carter learned, had their own complex feelings about the American presence. They were grateful for the help, certainly. The material support, the Lend-Lease equipment that had kept Britain in the fight, the promise of eventual liberation of occupied Europe, the sheer industrial might that America brought to the conflict. But they were also bemused, puzzled, and sometimes angered by American racial attitudes. An English woman named Margaret Stone, who worked as a nurse at the local hospital, explained it to Carter one evening when she stopped into the White Hart with two colleagues. Margaret was perhaps 30. With intelligent eyes and a directness Carter found both refreshing and slightly terrifying. She didn't mince words. "We're not perfect. Don't misunderstand me," she said, leaning against the bar with her half-pint of mild. "We've got our own empire, and all that entails, and there's plenty of hypocrisy to go around. We're perfectly happy to rule over millions of Indians and Africans, and tell ourselves it's for their own good. But what you Americans do, this segregation business, it's just baffling. You're here fighting for freedom, you say. Freedom from tyranny. Freedom for democracy. And yet you've brought your own tyranny with you, haven't you? You've brought your own system of who's allowed to sit where and drink where and walk where. It's not right and it makes no sense." Carter didn't know what to say. He'd never heard a white person speak so bluntly about segregation as a moral wrong, not as a political issue or a regional custom or a matter of preference, but as simply fundamentally wrong. "Most of us don't understand it," Margaret continued, her two colleagues nodding agreement. "And we're not going to enforce it, no matter how much pressure your military police apply. This is our country, our pubs, our streets. If we say a man in uniform is welcome, then he's welcome. End of discussion. We don't have to like it that you Americans bring your prejudices with you, and we certainly don't have to participate in them." Her colleague, a younger woman named Sarah with red hair and a spray of freckles across her nose, added, "My brother's in Burma right now, fighting alongside all sorts. Indians, Africans, Gurkhas, everyone. What would I say to him if I told him I'd refuse to share a pub with an American soldier because of his skin? He'd be ashamed of me. I'd be ashamed of myself. We're all on the same side, aren't we? We're all trying to stop the same enemy. The rest is just nonsense." These conversations gave Carter a framework for understanding what was happening. The British weren't colorblind. They had their own prejudices, their own class systems that Carter was only beginning to understand, their own hierarchies and assumptions. But they didn't have American-style segregation, and they viewed it with genuine incomprehension and disgust. To them, a soldier was a soldier. A working man was a working man. The distinctions Americans insisted upon seemed not just wrong, but bizarre, illogical, a waste of energy and goodwill at a time when both were in short supply. As winter turned to early spring in 1943, Carter's circle of acquaintances in Lavenham grew. He was invited to Sunday dinner by the Whitmore family, an occasion that involved roast chicken, scarce and precious under rationing, and conversation that ranged from local gossip to global strategy. He attended a local dance, though he sat out most of it, not wanting to create problems by dancing with white women, though several asked and seemed puzzled by his refusal. He helped repair a fence for one of the farmers he'd befriended, spending a Saturday afternoon digging post holes and stretching wire while learning about the challenges of wartime agriculture. He became, in short, a part of the community in a way that would have been absolutely impossible in Alabama. But he was also increasingly aware of the resentment building among white American troops. Fights broke out in nearby towns with increasing frequency. A black soldier was beaten severely in Ipswich by a group of white Americans who objected to seeing him walking with an English woman. Another was run off the road deliberately by a military truck. Tensions were escalating, and Carter could feel the pressure building like a storm front moving in. In late March, it came to the White Hart. Carter was at his usual spot near the fire, playing darts with Pemberton and two others, when 4 white American soldiers entered. They were already drunk, though from where Carter couldn't say. Perhaps they'd been drinking at another establishment, or perhaps they'd brought their own bottles, which some soldiers did. They surveyed the room with the aggressive swagger of men looking for trouble. Men who'd already decided they were going to find a fence regardless of what actually happened. One of them, a sergeant with a hard face and cold eyes, spotted Carter. He walked over, his 3 companions following like dogs behind their pack leader. "Well, well," the sergeant said loudly, his words slightly slurred. "Looks like somebody forgot to tell the local yokels about keeping things proper. Looks like somebody needs an education in how things work." The conversations in the pub stopped. Whitmore appeared from behind the bar, wiping his hands on his apron with deliberate slowness, his face carefully neutral but his eyes watchful. "Gentlemen," Whitmore said carefully, his voice carrying the kind of forced politeness that actually communicated the opposite. "You're welcome in my establishment if you're here to drink peacefully. If you're here for any other purpose, I'll ask you to leave. We don't tolerate trouble here." The sergeant ignored him, keeping his eyes on Carter. "Boy, I don't know what these people told you, but this ain't how things work. You need to drink with your own kind. You need to remember your place." Carter felt the old familiar tightness in his chest, the careful calculation of how to respond to this kind of provocation without making things worse. In Alabama, the calculation would have been simple: submit, apologize, leave. Here, 3,000 miles from home, he had no idea what the right response was. But before he could speak, Pemberton stepped forward, setting down his half-finished pint with a decisive thunk. "I'll thank you not to use that word in my presence," the old man said. His voice was quiet, but carried an edge of steel that Carter had never heard from him before. "This man is Corporal Carter, and he's my guest and my friend. You, Sergeant, are being rude and unpleasant. I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself further." The sergeant laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Old man, you don't know what you're dealing with. Where we come from, we know how to keep these people in their place. We know how things work. You do well to learn." "Where you come from is irrelevant," Whitmore said, his voice harder now, all pretense of politeness abandoned. "You're in England now, in Suffolk, in my pub. And in my pub, a soldier is a soldier. Corporal Carter is welcome. You, increasingly, are not. I'll give you 10 seconds to leave voluntarily, and then I'll fetch the constable." One of the other American soldiers put a hand on the sergeant's arm. "Come on, Sarge, this ain't worth it. Let's go somewhere else. There's other pubs." The sergeant shook him off violently. He stepped closer to Carter, close enough that Carter could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the redness in his face from years of drinking. "You think you're something special? You think these people respect you? They're just using you to irritate us. You're still just a—" He didn't get to finish the sentence. Davies, the school teacher, a man of perhaps 50 with thinning hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, who looked like he'd never been in a fight in his life, stepped between them. "Out," Davies said simply. His voice didn't shake despite the obvious fear on his face. "Out now, or I'll fetch the local constable and you can explain to him why you're disturbing the king's peace. I believe that's still a crime, even for American soldiers." For a long moment it could have gone either way. The sergeant's hands were clenched into fists. His face was flushed with anger and alcohol. Carter could see violence in his eyes, the desire to lash out, to enforce through physical force what he couldn't enforce through words. But he was also, Carter realized, uncertain. This wasn't Alabama or Georgia or any other place where he had the backing of local law enforcement and local custom. He was a foreigner here, and the locals were making it very clear whose side they were on. 3 more men had stood up, Carter noticed. They weren't saying anything, just standing there, but their message was clear. The sergeant would have to fight through all of them to get to Carter, and even drunk, he apparently had enough sense to realize those weren't good odds. "This ain't over," the sergeant finally said. He pointed at Carter with a shaking finger. "You watch yourself, you hear me? You watch yourself." The 4 Americans left, slamming the door behind them hard enough to rattle the windows. The moment the door closed, the tension in the room released like a held breath. Several people exhaled audibly. Someone made a joke about American manners that got a nervous laugh. Whitmore poured pints for Pemberton, Davies, and himself. He set a 4th in front of Carter. "On the house," he said. "All of them, and I don't want to hear another word about it. You're a good man, Corporal Carter, and you're always welcome here." Carter found his voice. "Thank you, all of you. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to risk trouble with the American military over me." "Didn't have to," Pemberton said, genuinely puzzled by the statement. Of course we did. They were being bullies and bores. Can't have that sort of thing, can we? This is a civilized establishment. We have standards. The incident became local news, spreading through Lavenham with the speed of all small-town gossip. By the next day, everyone in town seemed to know about it. The response was overwhelmingly supportive of Carter and the pub's stance. The local vicar, a gentleman named Reverend Matthews, mentioned it obliquely in his Sunday sermon, speaking about the Christian duty to welcome strangers and reject prejudice, to see the humanity in every person, regardless of their appearance. The constable, a stolid man named Hawkins who'd been on the force for 30 years, made a point of stopping by the White Hart to tell Whitmore he'd done right. "We've got enough problems without importing American ones," Hawkins said. "If those soldiers come back and cause trouble, you send for me immediately. I don't care what uniform they're wearing. They follow British law while they're on British soil." But Carter also knew it wasn't over. The sergeant had meant what he said, and increasingly black soldiers were finding themselves caught between British acceptance and American military discipline. Command structures were tightening. More establishments were being declared officially off-limits. The contradiction between fighting a war against tyranny while enforcing segregation was becoming harder to ignore. But the American military was choosing to respond by doubling down rather than examining its policies. In May 1943, Carter's unit received new orders. They were being transferred to a base in Dorset, further preparations for eventual operations across the Channel. His time in Lavenham was ending. The news hit Carter harder than he'd expected. He'd been in Lavenham for less than 4 months, but it had changed something fundamental in how he understood the world and his place in it. On his last evening, the White Hart threw him an unofficial farewell. It wasn't announced or formally organized, but word had spread through the town's informal communication networks, and when Carter arrived at 6 o'clock, the pub was full. Familiar faces, people he'd come to know over the past 4 months. Whitmore behind the bar, Pemberton at his usual seat, Davies with a stack of papers he'd been grading, Margaret and Sarah and 2 other nurses from the hospital. The farmers, the labourers, the old soldiers, the young women. Even the vicar, who rarely frequented pubs, stopped by to wish him well. They presented him with a gift, carefully wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a small leather-bound book with blank pages, but it wasn't blank anymore. They'd written their names and addresses, page after page of them, people he'd talked to, people he'd barely met, people who'd simply heard about him and wanted to be remembered. "So you can write," Pemberton explained, his voice gruff with emotion. "Let us know how you're getting on. Tell us about your adventures, and when this whole mess is over, you come back and visit properly. Stay for a month. We'll show you around. Take you to London, make a proper holiday of it." Carter felt his throat tighten. He'd received more genuine friendship and acceptance in 4 months in this small Suffolk town than in 26 years in America. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he simply nodded, clutching the book like it was the most precious thing he'd ever owned. Whitmore raised his glass. "To Corporal Carter," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "A good man, a good soldier, and a good friend. We've been honored to know you. You're always welcome at the White Hart, always. This is your pub now, same as it's ours. Remember that." The pub echoed with raised glasses and voiced agreement. Carter raised his own glass, managed to say thank you in a voice that didn't shake too badly, and drank deep to hide the emotion on his face. Later, when the crowd had thinned, and only a few close friends remained, Pemberton asked him a question that Carter had been thinking about himself. "Will you come back? After the war, I mean. To England, to Lavenham?" Carter thought about it carefully before answering. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've got family in Alabama. My mother, my sister and her children. I'd like to see them again, but this has been something I can't quite explain." "You've been treated like a human being," Pemberton said bluntly, cutting through Carter's attempt to find diplomatic words. "That shouldn't be remarkable, but there we are. You've been treated as you deserve to be treated, and it's shown you what's possible." "Yes," Carter said quietly. "That's exactly it." "Then remember it," Pemberton said, leaning forward with an intensity that made Carter meet his eyes. "Remember that it's possible. Remember that there are places in this world where a man is judged by his character and his actions, not by the color of his skin. And when you go home, whenever that is, you tell people what you experienced. You tell them that it doesn't have to be the way it's always been. You tell them that change is possible, that you've seen it with your own eyes. Carter kept the leather-bound book with him through the next 2 years. Through training in Dorset, where he found the local pubs similarly welcoming, though he was more cautious now, wary of provoking incidents. Through the crossing to France in late 1944 as part of the support operations following the initial landings, the 92nd Infantry Division finally getting its chance to prove itself in combat. Through the long push across Europe, the logistics work that kept armies supplied with ammunition and fuel and food across thousands of miles. He wrote letters when he could and received replies. Pemberton's grandson made it home from North Africa, wounded but alive, and wrote Carter a letter thanking him for keeping his grandfather's spirits up during those dark months of uncertainty. Davies was teaching again, despite being past retirement age, since so many younger teachers were in service. Margaret married an RAF officer who'd survived being taken down over France and spent 2 years evading capture. Whitmore's pub kept serving, though with fewer Americans after most of the troops moved to operational areas. Carter survived the war. He was in France when it ended, part of the massive logistical operation that kept armies supplied across thousands of miles of war-torn Europe. He earned a Bronze Star for his work coordinating supply deliveries under difficult conditions, keeping a critical supply line open when roads were damaged and bridges were down. He saw Paris, liberated and celebrating. He saw Munich, shattered and subdued. He saw Frankfurt, Strasbourg, a dozen other cities in various states of destruction and recovery. He saw devastation and liberation, defeat and victory, the full spectrum of what war could do to places and people. But his thoughts often returned to that small pub in Suffolk, to the warmth of the fire and the acceptance he'd found there, to the proof that the world could be different than what he'd always known. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, Carter faced a choice that thousands of black soldiers faced. Many black servicemen, having experienced life without Jim Crow, were reluctant to return to segregated America. They'd tasted freedom, genuine freedom, and the thought of going back to separate water fountains and separate waiting rooms and separate everything was almost unbearable. Some stayed in Europe, marrying local women, finding work, building new lives. The French were particularly welcoming, Carter heard. Some black soldiers had settled in Paris or other French cities and were doing well. The army offered Carter an opportunity to remain in Europe with occupation forces, a desk job in logistics with decent pay, and the possibility of bringing family over eventually. He thought about it for a long time. He thought about Lavenham, about England, about the possibility of a life where he wouldn't have to navigate segregation daily. He could get a job, maybe in supply chain management or logistics for a civilian company. The skills he'd learned in the army were valuable. He could save money, bring his mother and sister to England, start fresh in a place where they'd be treated like human beings. It was tempting, powerfully tempting. But he also thought about his mother, who'd raised him alone after his father died when Carter was 8, about his sister and her 3 children, who needed a man in their lives with so many black men absent or broken by the war and its aftermath, about the community he'd left behind in Birmingham, the church he'd grown up in, the neighbors who'd known him since childhood. And he thought about what Pemberton had said. Remember it. Tell people what you experienced. Tell them it doesn't have to be the way it's always been. Carter went home to Alabama in January 1946. He stepped off the train in Birmingham into a world that hadn't changed in his absence. Separate waiting rooms with the familiar signs, white and colored. Separate water fountains. Separate everything. The old familiar humiliations. The old familiar dance of navigating segregation without provoking violence. The conductor who made all the black passengers move to the colored car once the train entered Alabama. The taxi driver who refused to take him until he found one of the few colored cabs. The hostile stares from white people who objected to seeing a black man in uniform, as if his service meant nothing, or perhaps meant too much. But he carried with him the memory of another way of living, and he began, carefully and quietly, to tell people about it. He became active in his church, taking on teaching responsibilities in the Sunday school. He joined the local chapter of the NAACP, which was growing despite intimidation and harassment. He spoke to young people whenever he got the chance, telling them about his experiences, not making grand pronouncements, not preaching revolution, but simply sharing what he'd seen. A world where a black man could walk into a pub and be served without incident, where white people stood up for him when he was threatened, where friendship crossed racial lines as naturally as breathing. Many people didn't believe him. Some thought he was exaggerating or fantasizing, making up stories to make himself feel important. Others insisted that England was different, that what worked there could never work in America, that segregation was too deeply rooted in American culture to ever be changed. A few accused him of being influenced by communist ideas, a dangerous charge in the increasingly paranoid post-war years. But some listened, some heard in his stories the possibility of change, the evidence that segregation wasn't natural or inevitable, that human beings could choose differently. And in the years that followed, as the civil rights movement gained momentum, Carter's experiences became part of a larger narrative. He wasn't a leader or a famous figure. He never made speeches or led marches. But he was a witness. He could testify from personal experience that segregation wasn't universal, that it was a choice some societies made and others rejected. When younger activists talked about the possibility of change, Carter could say, "I've seen it, I've lived it, it's possible." Carter kept in touch with his friends in Lavenham. The letters became less frequent over the years as life intervened, as everyone got busy with jobs and families and the business of rebuilding after the war. But they never stopped entirely. Pemberton died in 1952 at the age of 79, and Carter received a letter from his daughter telling him that her father had often spoken of the American corporal who'd been such good company during those last years of his life. Whitmore ran the White Hart until 1960, when age and ill health forced him to sell it to a younger man. He wrote Carter a final letter before he died in 1962, reminiscing about the war years and the strange friendship they'd formed. Davies taught until 1958, then retired to write local histories that barely anyone read, but which carefully documented the small market town's role in the war. In 1963, 20 years after he'd left Lavenham, Carter received an unexpected letter from Margaret, the nurse he'd known. She'd kept his address all those years, updating it as he moved from one house to another within Birmingham. She wrote to tell him that the White Hart had been scheduled for demolition, part of a modernization scheme to update the town's infrastructure. Old buildings were to be torn down, new construction put up, the medieval character of the town traded for modern efficiency. But the town council, after heated debate that lasted months, had reversed the decision. The pub would be preserved as a historic building, protected from demolition or significant alteration, and they were placing a small plaque commemorating its role in the war, including a mention of the American soldiers, black and white, who'd been welcomed there, and the townspeople who'd stood against segregation. Margaret wrote, "I thought you'd want to know that those evenings weren't forgotten. What seemed like simple decency at the time, we now understand, was part of something larger. You helped teach us that, James. You and the others like you. By simply being yourselves, by simply expecting to be treated with dignity, you showed us what was at stake. The fight against segregation wasn't just an American issue. It was a human issue, a moral issue. And we got to play a small part in it, here in our little town. I hope things are improving where you are. I hope you're well. And I hope you know that you're still remembered here with great fondness." Carter folded the letter carefully and put it with the leather-bound book he still kept in a special place in his home. He was 50 by then, graying at the temples, wearing reading glasses. He'd married a teacher named Dorothy, a strong woman who shared his commitment to change and who wasn't intimidated by the risks that commitment entailed. They had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son, and he told them often about a pub in Suffolk where he'd learned that the world could be different than what they saw around them. The Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, a landmark achievement that Carter had worked toward in his own small way. Birmingham, ironically, became one of the most significant battlegrounds of the movement. The city that had given Carter his first experiences of segregation became the site of crucial demonstrations, confrontations, and eventually change. Carter participated in marches and sit-ins, always careful, always measured, but always present. He was arrested twice, once for sitting at a lunch counter and once for marching without a permit. Both times Dorothy bailed him out, proud and terrified in equal measure. He was there when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in Birmingham, part of the massive crowd that gathered to hear words of hope and challenge. He was there when the Freedom Riders came through, offering what support he could. He was there through the struggle that had seemed impossible in 1943, but which became the defining cause of a generation. And through it all, he carried the memory of the White Hart. He carried the knowledge that ordinary people could make extraordinary choices, that a publican could refuse to enforce segregation, that an old railway worker could stand up to a drunk sergeant, that a schoolteacher could step between a black soldier and a threat. These weren't heroes or saints in any grand sense. They were regular people who'd simply chosen decency over prejudice, who'd chosen to see a human being rather than a color. Carter lived to see the world change in ways he'd hardly dared imagine in 1943. He saw the legal structures of segregation dismantled piece by piece. He saw Black Americans voting without intimidation, holding public office, entering spaces that had been closed to them. He saw his own children graduate from integrated schools, attend integrated universities, pursue careers that would have been impossible for him. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice didn't disappear with the signing of laws. Economic inequality persisted. Violence still erupted periodically. But it was different. It was better. It was movement toward the world he'd glimpsed in England. In 1992, at the age of 75, Carter made a final trip to England. His children, all successful in their own right, pooled resources to send him and Dorothy for their 50th wedding anniversary. They visited London, toured the museums and monuments, played tourists with the enthusiasm of people who'd never expected to afford international travel. But the place Carter most wanted to see was Lavenham. They took a train from London much as Carter had done 50 years before. Though the trains were faster now and the stations modernized, the countryside looked much the same, rolling fields and small villages. When they arrived in Lavenham, Carter felt a shock of recognition. The town had changed less than he'd expected. The medieval buildings still leaned against each other in their familiar way. The streets were still narrow, though now accommodating cars instead of just pedestrians and the occasional horse-drawn cart. And the White Hart still stood, preserved as promised, still serving as a pub, though under new management. Carter walked in on a spring afternoon, Dorothy beside him, both of them moving slowly with the careful deliberation of people in their 70s. The interior was familiar and strange at once. The beams were the same, blackened with age, forcing Carter to duck just as he had 5 decades before. The fireplace was the same, though fitted now with gas instead of burning logs, but everything else had been updated, modernized, the rough edges smoothed away. The current publican, a young woman named Emma who couldn't have been more than 30, greeted them with professional friendliness. Carter explained who he was, why he'd come, his voice shaking slightly with emotion. Her eyes widened with recognition. "You're in the book," she said excitedly. "Wait here, please. Just wait one moment." She disappeared into the back and returned with a thick volume, a history of the pub compiled for its 550th anniversary, 10 years earlier. She turned to a section titled The War Years, and there, among photographs and documents, was a brief account of the White Hart's role in welcoming American soldiers of all races. There were names Carter recognized: Thomas Whitmore, publican; Arthur Pemberton, regular customer and defender of integration; Edward Davies, schoolteacher and man of principle; and there was his own name, Corporal James William Carter, 92nd Infantry Division, listed among those who'd found friendship and acceptance there during the dark years of war. Carter stood looking at the page for a long time, Dorothy's hand in his. The young publican asked if they'd like a drink on the house in honor of his service. Carter accepted. They sat near the fireplace, in almost the same spot where he'd sat 50 years before, and he told Dorothy stories he'd told her before, but which gained new resonance in this place. He told her about Pemberton and Davies and Whitmore, about Margaret and Sarah, about the sergeant who'd threatened him and the townspeople who'd stood up for him, about learning that the world could be different than what he'd always known. They stayed for several hours. Other customers came and went. some of them locals who remembered the stories even if they hadn't been born when Carter was last there. Emma showed them the plaque that had been installed outside, commemorating the pub's role in the war and its stand against segregation. Carter stood in front of it, reading the words carefully, feeling the weight of history and memory. As they prepared to leave, Carter paused at the door, looking back at the interior one last time. It occurred to him that this building had indeed witnessed history, just as Davies had said all those years ago. 565 years of history now, continuous operation through wars and peace, plague and prosperity, the rise and fall of empires. And he'd been part of that history. A small part, perhaps, but part of it nonetheless. Carter died in 1998 at the age of 81. His obituary in the Birmingham News mentioned his military service, his Bronze Star, his work in the civil rights movement, his 47 years of marriage to Dorothy, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. But at his funeral, his oldest daughter Marjorie read from the leather-bound book he'd treasured all his life, the names and addresses from Lavenham. She told the story of the White Hart, of the friendship her father had found there, of the lesson it had taught him about human possibility. "My father believed," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded church, "that change happens in small moments as much as large ones. It happens when a publican serves a customer who looks different, when an old man stands up to a bully, when a community chooses welcome over exclusion." He carried that belief from a small town in England to the streets of Birmingham, and it sustained him through everything that followed. Through the fear and the violence and the setbacks and the small victories. He never forgot that evening in January 1943, when he walked into a pub and was treated like a human being. It showed him what was possible, and he spent the rest of his life trying to make that possibility real. The White Hart still stands today, still serving customers, still bearing its plaque commemorating its role in the war. Visitors occasionally come specifically because of that history, wanting to see the place where American segregation met British resistance and found itself unwelcome. The story has been told and retold in books about the war, about the American presence in Britain, about the long struggle for civil rights. Historians have written about it. Filmmakers have considered adapting it. It's become part of the larger narrative of how the Second World War challenged and changed American racial attitudes. But the core of the story remains simple and profound. On a cold evening in January 1943, a black American soldier walked into an English pub expecting rejection and found acceptance instead. That moment and the months that followed changed him. It showed him that the world he knew wasn't the only world possible. It gave him hope that change was achievable, that human beings could choose differently, that the barriers of race and prejudice weren't as immutable as they seemed. And when he returned home, he carried that knowledge with him and shared it with anyone who would listen. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. It didn't happen in a single moment or through a single heroic act. It was quiet, incremental, built on countless small acts of decency and courage. A drink shared across racial lines. A conversation started. A friendship formed across boundaries that were supposed to be impassable. An old man standing up to a bully. A publican refusing to enforce unjust rules. A teacher stepping between a soldier and a threat. But those small acts accumulated into something larger, a testament to the simple truth that how we treat each other matters, that ordinary people making ordinary choices to be kind and fair and decent can shift the trajectory of history in ways we can barely imagine. James William Carter never forgot the lesson he learned in the White Hart. He carried it with him through war and peace, through struggle and triumph, through the long fight for civil rights that consumed his adult life. And in carrying that lesson, in sharing that story, in living out the principle that human dignity transcends race, he became part of something larger than himself. He became a witness to the possibility of change, proof that a better world wasn't just a dream, but something that could be built, one choice at a time, one act of decency at a time, one moment of genuine human connection at a time. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.